The sparring halberd missed my face by less than a hand's width, and the Veldrathi who swung it didn't even glance at me to see if I flinched. That was the kind of day it was inside Commander Duhol's Applied Lethality class. 60 cadets from 11 species crammed into a tiered arena built for war games, and every single one of us knew that today's ranked rotation would redraw the lines of power in our graduating cohort. Rankings at the Conclave War Academy on Station de Demara were not vanity numbers. They decided postings, and postings decided whether your family name climbed or fell across the next century of galactic politics. I had clawed my way to 19th, which was respectable for a Cathori, and I intended to hold it. My name is Vreth Solani. I have 4 arms, a segmented exoskeleton the color of tarnished copper, and compound eyes that process movement faster than most species can blink. That last trait is the only reason I caught what happened in Ring 6 that morning, and it is the reason the Academy Judicial Board dragged me into an interrogation chamber 14 hours later to describe it frame by frame. But I am getting ahead of myself. The Academy had admitted its first human cadets 6 cycles earlier, under the Terran Integration Compact. The decision was controversial in the way that polite institutions describe something most people consider a mistake. Humans were small. They carried no natural armor, no venom sacs, no redundant organs. Their homeworld was classified as a Category 7 death world, which sounded impressive until you realized they had evolved by running away from predators rather than eating them. Most cadets considered human enrollment a diplomatic courtesy extended by the Conclave Council to keep Earth's trade routes open. Nobody expected them to last past second term. There was one human in our advanced combat section, Lieutenant Marin Hale. She stood roughly 1.75 meters, had brown hair she kept braided tight against her skull, and carried herself with the quiet stillness of someone who had nowhere urgent to be. She was ranked 34th out of 60, which placed her squarely in the unremarkable middle of our cohort. Most cadets interpreted this as evidence that humans plateau early. They fight well enough to survive initial culling, then stall once the training demands genuine lethality. I knew better. I had been her assigned sparring partner for 3 rotations. Every time we trained together, she used a different approach. Different stance, different guard, different rhythm. The first session she fought like a Drenari, all lateral movement and evasion. The second she adopted something closer to Cathori infighting, heavy on joint manipulation and pressure point targeting. The third she used techniques I could not identify at all, flowing between styles so smoothly that my compound eyes struggled to categorize the transitions. She never beat me decisively. She never lost decisively either. She just kept adjusting, session after session, as though I were a puzzle she was solving from multiple angles simultaneously. I did not tell anyone about this, partly because I was not certain what it meant, partly because saying a human ranked 34th was studying me implied that I, ranked 19th, should be concerned about it, and I was not ready to admit that to myself. The person everyone should have been concerned about was Korvan Desari. Korvan was Veldrathi, his species bred for size, bone density, and raw physical dominance. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, wrapped in natural plating that could deflect a standard sidearm round, and moved with the arrogant precision of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He was ranked 3rd. His family, House Desari, funded the Academy's entire biomedical research wing and had produced 11 admirals across 4 generations. Korvan treated the institution less like a school and more like a personal proving ground he happened to share with lesser organisms. He had despised human enrollment from the first day. He called it contamination. He filed formal objections with the Academic Council every quarter, requesting the removal of human cadets from advanced tier sections. When those objections were denied, he moved to more direct methods. He shoulder-checked Marin in corridors, hard enough to crack the composite paneling behind her. He mocked her scores in front of assembled cadets, loudly, making sure the translators carried every syllable. He once knocked a tray of rations out of her hands in the commissary and told her to eat off the floor, because that was how they fed animals on his estate. Marin never responded, not once. She picked up the tray, cleaned the floor, and walked away. Every time. Some cadets admired her restraint. Most interpreted it as submission, Korvan interpreted it as confirmation that humans were exactly what he said they were, soft-skinned prey pretending to be predators. 2 weeks before the bracket reseeding, I watched him corner Marin in a supply corridor after evening drills. He leaned over her, all 3 meters of him blocking the light, and told her the only reason she was still breathing was because the academy had rules. He said it quietly, the way people say things they actually mean, the way people say things they are already planning to make true. Marin looked up at him and said nothing. She waited until he moved, and then she walked away. No fear, no anger, no reaction at all. She walked the way someone walks through rain that everyone else is running from. That scared me more than anything Korvan had ever done. That morning, Commander Dole stepped into the center of the arena and activated the ranking display. A holographic bracket expanded above the sparring rings, showing the day's matchups. I scanned for my name, found it paired against a Threniki, whose tail strikes I had already learned to anticipate, and relaxed slightly. Then I saw the pairing in Ring 6, Korvan Dasari versus Marin Hale. The noise in the arena dropped by half. 60 cadets processing the same information simultaneously, running the same mental calculation, arriving at the same conclusion. This was not a fair match. Korvan outranked Marin by 31 positions. He outweighed her by a factor of 4. He was armored. She was not. By any objective measure, the bracket algorithm had just paired a career predator with an afternoon snack. I looked down at Marin. She was standing near Ring 6, reading the bracket with the same expression she wore when reviewing a cafeteria menu. No surprise, no fear, no tension in her shoulders. She nodded once, as though confirming something she had already expected, and began wrapping her hands with standard sparring tape. Korvan saw her wrapping her hands and laughed loud enough for the upper tiers to hear. He turned to his entourage, 3 Veldrathi cadets who followed him like ornamental bodyguards, and said something I could not quite catch. They laughed too. I did not laugh. I had sparred with Marin Hale. I had felt the speed of those hands. I had watched her eyes track my movements with a precision that my own compound vision struggled to match. I had experienced the disorienting sensation of throwing a strike I was certain would land and finding empty air where she had been a fraction of a second earlier, her body already repositioned at an angle that turned my own momentum into a disadvantage. She was ranked 34th because she chose to be ranked 34th. I was certain of this now, watching her calmly wrap her knuckles while the largest Veldrathi in our cohort prepared to put her through a wall. She had been managing her placement deliberately, staying visible enough to avoid scrutiny, but unremarkable enough to avoid exactly this kind of attention. I had sparred with her 9 times across 3 rotations. In those 9 sessions, I had cataloged 23 distinct fighting styles, any one of which would have placed her significantly higher in the rankings, if she had used it consistently. She never did. She never even used the same style twice in the same session. The closest I had come to understanding her method was during our 7th session, when she switched styles mid-exchange, transitioning from a Drenari-derived evasion pattern to something that looked almost Cathori, all infighting and pressure work, without any pause or reset between the two. The transition was so seamless that I lost 3 seconds of tactical awareness processing what I had just seen, which is an eternity in close-quarters combat, and should have cost me the exchange. She let me recover. She always let me recover. That was the other pattern I had noticed, and refused to name until now. She was always in control of the pace. When I pressed an advantage, it was because she permitted the advance. When I scored a point, it was because she chose not to defend it. My compound eyes are among the best sensory instruments in the Conclave's arsenal. They process micro-movements, weight shifts, muscle contractions, at a resolution that gives my species a significant edge in close combat. And even with that advantage, I could not catch the moment when she decided to stop being fast. I could only register the outcome. Suddenly she was slower. Suddenly she was within my range. Suddenly I landed a strike that my analytical functions were already flagging as too clean, too easy, too convenient. Something had changed. Either the bracket algorithm had finally forced her hand, or she had decided the game of hiding was over. Commander Dole circled the rings, reviewing matchups, adjusting equipment. He paused at ring 6, looked at the bracket, then looked at Marin. I saw him hesitate. Dole was Rathani, a species known for caution and meticulous risk assessment, and everything about his body language said this pairing troubled him. But the bracket algorithm was impartial by design. Overriding it required a formal petition and a 72-hour review. He did not have that kind of time, and the political cost of appearing to protect a human cadet from a fair match would have been worse than letting it proceed. He moved on. I finished my own bout against the Threniki in 6 minutes. Clean takedown, joint lock, submission. I barely registered it. My attention was already fixed on ring 6, where Korvan was making his entrance with the subtlety of a warship arriving at a diplomatic function. He carried an approved sparring halberd, a weighted polearm with a blunted striking surface, designed for training bouts. In his hands it looked like a toy. His bone plating caught the arena lights as he rolled his shoulders, and the sound it produced, a deep grinding click, was designed by evolution to intimidate prey species into freezing. Half the observation tier shifted uncomfortably. Marin stepped into the ring from the opposite side. She carried nothing. She walked past the weapons rack without pausing, and took her position in the center mark with her hands loose at her sides. Commander Dole stepped forward. He looked at Marin's empty hands, then at the weapons rack, then back at Marin. Cadet Hale, do you wish to select a training weapon? No, sir. Do you wish to forfeit the bout? No, sir. A ripple of laughter moved through the upper tiers. Korvan grinned, showing teeth that could crack bone. He planted his halberd against the floor and leaned on it with performative ease. I'll try not to break anything important, he said. Your species heals slowly. Marin said nothing. She adjusted her footing by a few centimeters and settled her weight evenly between both feet. Her hands remained open, fingers relaxed, palms facing slightly inward. It was a stance I did not recognize from any combat discipline in the Academy's curriculum. Commander Dole raised his hand. The arena displays locked to ring 6. 60 cadets leaned forward. Begin. A feeling settled into my thorax, cold and tight, like swallowing a stone. I had 3 rotations of sparring data telling me that Marin Hale was not what she appeared to be, and I had just watched her step into a ring unarmed against the 3rd-ranked cadet in our cohort. A cadet who wanted to hurt her, who had always wanted to hurt her, and who now had institutional permission to try. She was not afraid. That was what terrified me. I had seen cadets face unfavorable matchups before. They masked their fear with bravado, or grim determination, or cold focus. Marin did none of those things. She simply stood in the ring, the way you stand in a room you have already measured. Every wall, every exit, every line of sight cataloged and filed before you ever walked through the door. Korvan charged. The arena shook with the weight of his stride. And Marin Hale watched him come the way a surgeon watches a patient being wheeled into the operating theater. Not with malice, not with excitement, with preparation. Korvan covered 12 meters of ring floor in less than 2 seconds. His opening strike was textbook Veldrothi doctrine, a diagonal sweep with the halberd, designed to force a smaller opponent into a predictable evasion lane where the follow-up strike would be waiting. It was the same technique that had put 14 cadets in the medical wing across 3 semesters. It was fast, brutal, and almost impossible to counter, because by the time you recognized the pattern, the second strike was already in motion. Marin was not there when it arrived. The halberd passed through the space her torso had occupied and hit nothing but air. She had dropped her center of gravity and shifted laterally in a single motion, so efficient that my compound eyes, processing movement at 4 times the standard visual frame rate of most species in the arena, barely caught the transition. One moment she was in the strike path, the next she was 2 meters to Korvan's right, standing with the same relaxed posture, her hands still open at her sides. She did not counter, she did not strike, she just moved. The arena made a collective sound, somewhere between confusion and disappointment. This was supposed to be a fight, not a game of keep-away. Korvan snarled and reset his stance, bringing the halberd back to guard position. His bone plating flushed a deeper shade of gray, a Veldrathi stress response that most species mistook for rage. It was closer to humiliation. He charged again, faster this time, abandoning the textbook approach for raw speed. The halberd came in horizontal, chest height, with enough force to shatter the sparring barrier behind her if it connected. Merrin ducked. Not a dramatic dive or a stumbling retreat. A precise lowering of her body by exactly the amount required to let the weapon pass over her head. Her eyes never left Korvan's torso. I noticed this because it was wrong. Every combat doctrine I had ever studied taught fighters to track the weapon, to watch the point of impact and respond accordingly. Merrin was not watching the halberd at all. She was watching his body, the way his weight shifted, the way his plating articulated around his joints, the rhythm of his breathing through his auxiliary vents. She was reading his anatomy in real time. The third strike came from above, a vertical chop meant to split her guard and drive her to the ground. Merrin sidestepped again, this time moving inside the arc of the swing rather than away from it. For a fraction of a second, she was close enough to touch Korvan's forearm. She did not touch it. She just noted the position and moved away. Korvan was breathing hard now, not from exertion. A Veldrathi of his conditioning could sustain combat output for 30 minutes without significant fatigue. He was breathing hard because nothing was working. He had thrown 3 of the most devastating strikes in his repertoire, attacks that had ended bouts in seconds, against opponents ranked higher than Merrin, and she had treated each one like a minor inconvenience, stepping around them with the casual efficiency of someone avoiding puddles on a walkway. The crowd had stopped laughing. I leaned forward in my seat, all 4 arms gripping the railing. Something was building in the ring, a pressure I could feel in my carapace the way you feel a storm approaching through changes in atmospheric density. Korvan's frustration was escalating on a trajectory I recognized from behavioral studies of his species. Veldrathi, who feel their dominance challenged, do not de-escalate. They do not reconsider their approach. They commit harder, faster, with less restraint, until the challenge is eliminated, or they collapse from overexertion. Korvan was not close to overexertion. He was close to something worse. The 4th exchange confirmed it. He threw the halberd aside. The weapon clattered across the ring floor, and the sound it made was final. He did not need it. His species had built-in weapons far more dangerous than anything on the approved rack. He closed the distance with 2 massive strides and swung his right arm in a hooking arc, aimed at Merrin's midsection, using his bone-plated forearm like a battering ram. Merrin pivoted, the arm passed her by centimeters. She was inside his guard now, close enough to smell the chemical stress markers leaking from his auxiliary vents, and still she did not strike. She repositioned, created space, returned to her neutral stance. Open hands, even breathing, eyes fixed on his center mass. I understood then what she was doing, and the understanding dropped through me like ice water through a cracked shell. She was not avoiding his attacks because she could not handle them. She was avoiding them because she was gathering data. Every strike he threw gave her information about how he moved, how his plating articulated under torque, where the gaps in his natural armor appeared during maximum extension. She was letting him attack because his attacks were teaching her everything she needed to know. She was running a diagnostic on a living weapon system, and the weapon system was too furious to realize it was being studied. A Drenari cadet sitting next to me whispered something I did not catch. I turned long enough to see his face and recognized the expression immediately. It was the look of someone who had just realized they were watching a predator hunt, and the predator was not the one everyone had assumed. Commander Dahol was standing at the edge of the ring. His hand was near the emergency halt control on his wrist, and his posture had shifted from the neutral stance of a referee overseeing a routine bout to the rigid alertness of someone who senses that the situation is moving beyond the boundaries of what the rules were designed to contain. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it the way any veteran feels, the moment a training exercise crosses the line into something real. But the rules said the bout was still legal. Neither combatant had committed a foul. The evasions were clean. The attacks were within parameters. The fact that one combatant was dismantling the other's confidence, without throwing a single strike, was not grounds for intervention. Not yet. The 5th exchange broke the world in half. Korvan lunged forward, and this time I heard a sound I had never heard in a training bout. A wet, mechanical click, like cartilage snapping into a locked position. Along both of his forearms, bone spur implants extended through slits in his plating. 8 centimeters of sharpened bone alloy, surgically anchored to his skeletal frame, honed to a molecular edge. They were designed for one purpose only: to puncture armor and sever arteries. They were classified as lethal augmentation. They were explicitly banned from ranked sparring under Section 14 of the Academy Combat Code. Their deployment in a training bout was a criminal act. Corvan did not care. He was past caring. The thing in front of him had humiliated him in front of 60 cadets, and he was going to end it the way his ancestors ended disputes, with something dead on the ground. He drove the right spur straight at Marin's throat. Commander Dole screamed for a halt. His voice cracked across the arena's amplification system. Every cadet in the observation tier jolted. The medical team surged toward Ring 6. None of them were fast enough. What happened next took less than 3 seconds. I know this because the Academy's combat recording system timestamps every frame, and I reviewed the footage 17 times during the investigation. 3 seconds. That is how long it took Marin Hale to disassemble the third-ranked cadet at the Conclave War Academy. She dropped beneath the spur thrust. Not backward, not sideways, but straight down, her knees folding with a mechanical precision that placed her center of gravity below Corvan's extended arm, in a position no Veldrathi combat doctrine accounted for, because no Veldrathi opponent had ever been small enough or fast enough to occupy that space. Her left hand seized his wrist at a point I would later learn was designated VT3 in Terran combat anatomy charts, the junction where Veldrathi forearm plating meets the softer cartilage of the wrist joint. Her right hand locked onto the nerve cluster above his elbow, a point called VT7, where 3 major neural pathways converge beneath a thin seam in the bone plating. She applied rotational force in 2 opposing directions simultaneously. The arm broke, not fractured, broke. The sound was the worst thing I have ever heard in a training facility. A deep, structural crunch followed by the sharper crack of bone spurs being wrenched from their surgical anchors by the torque of their own host's skeleton rotating against its design parameters. Corvan's right bone spur, the one aimed at Marin's throat a second earlier, redirected into his own neck. The trajectory was not accidental. She had calculated the angle. She had used his own implant, his own illegal weapon, as the instrument of his death, driving it into the gap between his second and third cervical plates, where the carotid analog ran close to the surface. But she was not done. She followed his collapsing body to the ground, her legs wrapping around his torso in a locking configuration that used his own mass to anchor her position. Her arms shifted to his neck, applying a compression technique I had never seen in any combat manual at the Academy. I would later learn it was called a modified vascular restraint, designed specifically for Veldrathi physiology. It targeted the 4 arterial feeds to the Veldrathi brain by using the species' own bone plating as a compression surface. The very armor that made Veldrathi nearly invincible in open combat became a trap. The plating could not flex enough to relieve the pressure. The harder his body tried to resist, the tighter the lock became. His legs kicked twice. His remaining arms scraped against the ring floor, bone spurs leaving gouges in the composite surface. Then he stopped moving. By the time Commander Dole crossed the ring floor, Corvan Dasari was dead. Marin released the hold. She stood. She stepped back. Her breathing was steady, her pulse visible at her throat, beating no faster than a standard resting rate. There was no blood on her. It was all on the floor beneath Corvan, pooling from the wound his own spur had made in his own neck. The arena was silent, not the productive silence of focused attention or the respectful silence of ceremony. This was the silence of 60 predatory species, simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of what they were sharing a building with. I could not move. My 4 arms were locked on the railing, my compound eyes fixed on the ring below, every facet processing the image of a creature half Corvan's size, standing calmly beside his body, as though she had just completed a routine maintenance procedure. Commander Dahl reached the ring. His voice, when he finally managed to produce it, was stripped of its usual authority. Cadet Hale. The halt was called. Marin looked at him. Her expression was calm, almost apologetic, the way someone looks when they regret an outcome, but not the decision that produced it. He deployed lethal implants against an unarmed opponent, sir. Under Article 9 of the Academy Charter, I had the legal right to respond with equivalent force. She paused. I did. Dolul stared at her. He stared at Corvan. He stared at the bone spurs still extended from Corvan's left arm, gleaming under the arena lights, proving her claim beyond any possible dispute. Medical team, he said quietly, and security. They took Marin out through the side corridor. She walked between two armed security officers without resistance, without hurry, without looking back. As she passed beneath the observation tier, she glanced up. Our eyes met. My compound vision locked onto her face, and read it with every facet available to me. She was not proud. She was not shaken. She was already processing what came next, calculating variables, assessing outcomes, preparing for the storm she knew was about to descend. The cadets around me were whispering. Some were terrified, some were angry. A cluster of Veldrathi in the upper tier were already transmitting messages to their delegation, their plating flushed dark with a fury that would soon metastasize into political crisis. A Threniki cadet 2 rows behind me was weeping, though I could not tell if the tears were from horror or from the sudden understanding that the carefully maintained hierarchy of the Academy's combat rankings had been a fiction all along, a polite arrangement that one species had been silently tolerating while it watched and waited and catalogued. I stayed in my seat for a long time after the arena emptied. The medical team had removed Corvan's body, but the gouges from his bone spurs were still carved into the ring floor. The cleaning drones had not yet reached the blood. A maintenance team arrived to assess the cracked composite where his halberd had struck the ground during the early exchanges, and I watched them scan the damage with the detached professionalism of people who did not yet know what had happened in this room. To them it was just a cracked floor. To me it was a geological record, a stratigraphy of escalation marked in shattered material. Each impact point telling the story of a creature who grew more desperate with each swing, because the universe was not behaving the way he demanded it to. I kept replaying what I had seen, not the kill itself, though that was seared into my memory with forensic clarity. I replayed the 4 evasions that preceded it, the way she watched his body instead of his weapon, the way she moved inside his range to study the articulation of his plating, the way she let him escalate, let him commit, let him deploy his hidden weapons and reveal the full architecture of his attack, before she responded with a technique so precisely tailored to his species that it turned his greatest evolutionary advantage into the mechanism of his death. She had not fought Corvan Dasari. She had solved him. And I, sitting alone in an empty arena, with the chemical scent of Veldrathi blood still hanging in the recycled air, realized something that would keep me awake for the next 47 hours. She had been solving me too. Every sparring session, every rotation, every time she let me land a strike, I was increasingly certain she could have avoided. She had been mapping my species the same way she mapped his. The difference was that Corvan gave her a reason to use what she learned. I had not. Not yet. The thought lodged itself in my thorax like a shard of broken chitin, and I could not dislodge it no matter how many times I told myself that Marin Hale was my training partner, my colleague, a fellow cadet at an institution that existed to produce soldiers, not executioners. She killed him in 3 seconds. That was the number that would not leave me. 3 seconds from first contact to confirmed death, against the 3rd-ranked cadet in the most prestigious military academy in the known galaxy. I had sparred with her 9 times. She had never once used anything close to that speed. The political detonation hit Station Damara before the blood in Ring 6 was dry. Within 4 hours of Corvan's death, House Dasari's diplomatic liaison had transmitted a formal demand to the Conclave Council, requiring the immediate arrest, expulsion, and extradition of Marin Hale to Veldrathi judicial space. The charge was premeditated murder of a sovereign noble, a category of offense that carried execution under Veldrathi law and had triggered 3 interstellar wars in the last millennium when applied across species lines. The Academy's communication network, which normally carried training schedules and mess hall menus, was saturated with encrypted diplomatic traffic. I knew this because my quarters were located 1 deck below the signal's relay junction, and the vibration from the overloaded transmitters made my ceiling hum like a tuning fork for 2 straight days. The narrative that emerged from the Veldrathi delegation bore almost no resemblance to what I had witnessed in the ring. In their version, A human savage had attacked an unarmed cadet during a routine sparring exercise and killed him with banned techniques before anyone could intervene. Corvan's bone spur implants were not mentioned. His weeks of documented harassment were not mentioned. The fact that Marin had entered the ring, carrying no weapon, while Corvan carried a halberd and concealed lethal augmentations was not mentioned. The story was simple, clean, and engineered to produce outrage. A Deathworlder had murdered a nobleman's son. It worked. Within 12 hours, 3 Conclave member species had issued statements expressing concern about human integration into military institutions. 2 others pulled their cadets from joint training exercises with human participants. The station's civilian quarter, home to roughly 15,000 support personnel and their families, reported a 300% increase in security complaints filed against human residents for offenses ranging from intimidation to existing in public spaces while being from Earth. A Veldrathi merchant on the station's commercial level refused to serve a human engineer and was not reprimanded for it. The engineer left without protest. I wondered, afterward, whether she had been trained too. I was pulled into the investigation on the second day. Academy Judicial Affairs called me in first. 2 Rathani officers who asked precise questions in the precise order I expected, focusing on the chronology of events, the positions of cadets in the ring, the exact sequence of strikes and evasions. I told them the truth. I told them about the 4 evasions, the escalation, the bone spur deployment, the 3-second sequence. They recorded everything and thanked me for my cooperation. The Veldrathi investigators were different. There were 3 of them, all from House Dasari's private judicial corps, wearing armor that cost more than my family's entire estate. They did not ask questions so much as construct a narrative and invite me to confirm it. Had I noticed aggressive behavior from the human prior to the bout? Had Cadet Hale made threats? Was it possible the bone spur deployment was a defensive response to an unseen human attack? I told them no, to all of it. They did not thank me for my cooperation. What disturbed me most was not the bias in their questions, which I expected, but the complete absence of interest in the bone spur deployment. I mentioned it 3 times. I described the sound the implants made when they extended. I told them the spurs were visible on the security recording. Each time, the lead investigator made a notation and moved to a different question. They were not ignoring the evidence. They were routing around it, building a case architecture that could stand without acknowledging the single fact that dismantled their entire narrative. It was legal engineering of the most cynical kind, and watching it happen in real time gave me a clarity about institutional power that no academy lecture had ever provided. On the same day, I learned that Marin's formal complaint about Corvan's harassment had been flagged in the academy's administrative system as under review for 6 consecutive weeks. I obtained this information from a Rathani administrative clerk who owed me a favor from a joint logistics exercise the previous term. The clerk told me the complaint had been received, logged, assigned a case number, and then placed in a processing queue behind 14 other complaints, 7 of which involved Corvan Dasari. 7. The 3rd-ranked cadet in the academy had 7 active complaints filed against him by cadets from 5 different species, and not a single one had been investigated. House Dasari's quarterly funding transfer to the academy coincided almost exactly with the date the oldest complaint entered the review queue, and nobody in the administrative chain appeared to find this timing remarkable. The 3rd interview was the one that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. A human woman I had never seen before appeared in the investigation wing without an appointment. She carried no rank insignia, no unit identification, no academy credentials. She wore civilian clothes, sat down across from me in an empty debriefing room, and asked me questions that had nothing to do with the fight. She wanted to know about Corvan's behavior in the weeks before the incident. Not the physical harassment, that was already documented, but the pattern of it. How frequently he targeted Marin, whether the severity escalated over time, whether he ever made comments about what he intended to do to her in a ranked bout, whether other cadets reported his behavior through official channels and what happened when they did. I answered everything. I told her about the shoulder checking, the tray incident, the formal objections, the public mockery. I told her that at least 4 cadets had reported Corvan's behavior to academy administration, and that nothing had been done, because House Desari's funding made Corvan functionally untouchable within the institution's disciplinary framework. The woman made notes on a device I did not recognize. She did not introduce herself. She did not explain who she worked for. When she finished, she stood, thanked me by name even though I had not given it to her, and left. I spent the next 6 hours in the Academy archives, doing something I should have done months earlier. I pulled Marin Hale's intake file. What I found rewired the architecture of my assumptions. Marin was not listed as a standard military cadet. Her enrollment category was marked as secondment, special programs, a classification I had never encountered. Her sponsoring institution was not Terran Defense Command or any branch of the human military I recognized. It was an office identified only by a 9-digit numerical code. No name, no location, no public contact information. I dug deeper. Her training record was partially redacted, sections blacked out at what appeared to be a classification level above what the Academy's systems were designed to display. But the portions that remained were enough. Her cumulative combat training hours were listed at 47,000. I read the number 3 times to make sure my translator was not malfunctioning. 47,000 hours. I ran the conversion. At 8 hours per day, every day, with no interruptions, 47,000 hours represented roughly 16 standard cycles of continuous training. Her file listed her age at enrollment as 26. Her file also listed her entry into something called the Terran Integrated Combat Program at age 14. She had been training to fight since before most cadets in our cohort had completed their primary education. And not general training, not the broad-spectrum physical conditioning that military academies provided. Her specialization codes, the ones that were not redacted, listed individual species by name. Veldrathi, Cathori, Drenari, Rethani, Thranaki. 12 more I recognized, 6 I did not. I sat in the archive terminal for a long time, staring at a file that described a human being who had spent 12 years learning how to fight every major species in the known galaxy, using methodologies I could not access, because they were classified above my clearance level. 12 years. 11 hours a day, every day, since she was 14 years old. I tried to comprehend what that number meant in practical terms. 14 is young for a human. Their species matures slowly, compared to most conclave members. At 14, a human is still growing, still developing the neural pathways that will define their adult cognition. Marin Hale had entered a program designed to teach her the biological weaknesses of alien species before she had finished developing her own biology. She had spent her adolescence, the period most humans devote to education, socialization, and the slow process of figuring out who they are, learning instead how to take apart every sentient being she might encounter. The commitment required was not merely physical, it was existential. She had given her childhood to a program that turned her into a walking encyclopedia of interspecies lethality. And she had done it so thoroughly that by the time she arrived at the academy, she was already more dangerous than any instructor on the staff. The file also contained a single medical notation that I almost missed. Psychological evaluation status, monitored, not cleared, not flagged, monitored. As though someone in the program recognized that training a child to kill dozens of species might produce psychological effects worth tracking, but not worth interrupting the training to address. The clinical efficiency of that notation disturbed me more than the training hours. Then I went to find Marin. She was confined to her quarters but not formally arrested. The legal distinction mattered because it meant the academy had not yet decided whether she was a criminal or a victim, and that ambiguity was currently the only thing preventing the Veldrathi from having her dragged off the station in chains. 2 armed security officers stood outside her door. They let me in after verifying my academy identification, which told me that Marin's legal team, wherever they were, had not restricted her visitor access. Her quarters were standard cadet issue, a bunk, a desk, a storage locker. She was sitting on the floor with her legs crossed, her eyes closed, her hands resting on her knees. She did not open her eyes when I entered, but she said my name before I spoke. Vreth, I was wondering when you would come. I stood in the doorway, all forearms folded, my exoskeleton itching with the kind of nervous energy that my species expresses through involuntary chromatophore shifts. I was probably cycling through 3 different stress colors without realizing it. "What is the Integrated Combat Program?" I asked. She opened her eyes. Brown, unremarkable, indistinguishable from a billion other humans if you did not know what they had been trained to see. "How much of my file were you able to access?" "Enough to know you have more training hours than every cadet in this academy combined. Enough to know you have been at this since you were 14. Enough to know your specialization codes list species by name." She was quiet for a long time, not the evasive silence of someone deciding how to lie, but the careful silence of someone measuring how much truth the listener can process at once. "It is exactly what it sounds like," she said. "When humanity made first contact, we realized immediately that we were surrounded by species that were stronger, faster, more durable, more naturally lethal than we could ever be. We could not change our biology. We could not grow armor or develop venom. What we could do was learn." She paused. "The program recruits humans at a young age and trains them in the combat traditions, anatomical profiles, and physiological weak points of every known species. Every hold, every pressure point, every vulnerability. Not just the major species. All of them. Every variant, every augmentation package. You did not just react to Corvan, you executed a technique designed specifically for his species. VT7, she said. Veldrathi Takedown, Variant 7. It exploits the neural convergence point above the elbow and uses the rigidity of Veldrathi cervical plating to create a compression trap against the carotid analog. It is one of 12 techniques in the Veldrathi Close Quarters module. 12. 12. Each designed for a different tactical scenario. And the Cathori module? How many techniques are in that one? She looked at me. Her expression did not change. She did not answer the question, and her silence was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Because I was standing in front of her, and I am Cathori, and the answer to my question obviously included my species. She had spent 3 rotations sparring with me, and every moment of every session she had known exactly how to end me. Every adjustment I had watched her make, every stance she had shifted into, every puzzling variation in her technique, it was not experimentation. It was practice. She was refining her understanding of a species she had already been trained to destroy, and I had been helping her do it without ever understanding what I was participating in. I left her quarters feeling as though the floor of the station had shifted beneath me by some imperceptible degree. Every corridor looked different. Every human I passed, the handful of cadets from other sections, the support personnel, the cafeteria staff, every single one of them now occupied a different category in my threat assessment framework. Not because they had changed, because the information I used to evaluate them had changed. The political storm escalated through the 3rd and 4th day. The Veldrathi delegation formally threatened to withdraw from the conclave if Marin was not surrendered. Other species began filing intelligence inquiries about the Terran Integrated Combat Program, requesting disclosure of what techniques had been developed against their own biologies. The Terran Diplomatic Office on Station Damara issued a single response, 7 sentences long, that managed to simultaneously confirm the program's existence and reveal absolutely nothing about its capabilities. It was a masterwork of diplomatic non-communication, and it made everything worse because it proved the humans had something to hide and had no intention of revealing it. On the 5th day, Commander Dole called me to his office. Dole's office was austere even by Rathani standards. A desk, 2 chairs, a wall of tactical displays he rarely activated. He stood behind his desk with his hands clasped, his posture carrying the rigid discomfort of someone who had been reviewing disturbing information for too long. "Cadet Solani, you have been her sparring partner for 3 rotations." "Yes, sir." "You have filed 9 post-session reports describing your training bouts with Cadet Hale." "Yes, sir." Duell activated a display behind him. The combat recording from Ring 6 played in slow motion. The 3-second sequence stretched across 12 seconds of frame-by-frame analysis. He paused it at the moment Marin seized Corvan's wrist. "I have reviewed this footage 43 times, he said. "I have consulted with the Academy's combat doctrine specialists across 4 species disciplines. They have identified 4 distinct techniques in the sequence she used." He turned to face me, and I had never seen a Rathani officer look shaken before. It was deeply unsettling. The first technique was Veldrathi in origin. The wrist seizure, the pressure point targeting, the rotational mechanics, all of it derived from Veldrathi close combat doctrine, modified to be executed by a smaller organism. And the others, sir? The second technique was Kathori. The words hit me in the thorax like a physical blow. Sir? The leg lock configuration she used to anchor herself to Korvan's torso. It is a variant of the Kathori grappling form you call the spiral bind. Modified, scaled for human physiology, but structurally identical to a technique your species has used in close-quarters combat for 12 generations. I could not speak. The spiral bind was a technique taught only in Kathori military academies. It was classified. It was culturally sacred. And a human had used it in a sparring ring on a conclave station, as though it were a standard tool pulled from a standard toolkit. Dohel watched my reaction with the clinical attention of a diagnostician. The third and fourth techniques are not in any database I can access. I suspect they are from the program she mentioned, the one with the numerical designation. He deactivated the display. The room dimmed. He stood very still for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the professional distance of a commanding officer delivering a briefing. He sounded like what he was, a career soldier who had just discovered that the map he had been using to navigate the galaxy was missing an entire continent. In 40 years of combat instruction, I have trained cadets from 14 species. I have seen killing techniques from every major martial tradition in the conclave. I have never seen anything like what that woman did in Ring 6. Not the speed, not the brutality, the specificity. Every movement was designed for his species. Every point of contact targeted a vulnerability that was unique to Veldrathi anatomy. It was not a fight, it was an application, the execution of a pre-designed solution to a specific biological problem. He paused. He looked at me with an expression that was as close to fear as I had ever seen on a Rathani face. She knows how to kill your kind too, cadet. She has known since the day she started sparring with you. The tribunal convened 9 days after Korvan's death in a chamber I had never entered before, a vaulted hall on the Academy's administrative level, designed for judicial proceedings, that the institution technically maintained but had never expected to use. The ceiling was high enough to accommodate Veldrathi standing at full height, and the walls were lined with acoustic dampening panels that gave every voice a flat, authoritative quality, regardless of the species producing it. The panel consisted of Commander Dowal, 2 conclave judicial officers, a senior Dranari magistrate, and a Veldrathi representative from House Dasari, named Thorvin Dasari, Korvan's uncle. Thorvin was older than Korvan but built from the same template, massive, plated, and radiating the controlled fury of someone who had already decided the verdict and was enduring the process only because political necessity required it. The gallery was packed beyond capacity. Cadets from every section occupied the tiered seating, their species forming loose clusters, as though unconsciously sorting themselves by biological alliance. Faculty stood along the back wall. Diplomatic staff from 6 delegations filled the observers' gallery. The handful of human cadets from other sections sat together near the rear exit, close enough to leave quickly if the proceedings turned hostile, and their faces carried the blank, controlled expression I was beginning to recognize as a human stress response, the deliberate suppression of visible emotion that other species consistently misread as indifference. Marin entered without escort. She had been offered a defense advocate by both the Academy and the Terran delegation, and had declined both. She wore her standard cadet uniform, pressed and immaculate, her hair braided in the same tight configuration she wore in the ring. She carried a datapad and nothing else. The prosecution spoke first. A conclave judicial officer named Prathan Voss laid out a straightforward case. Marin Hale used lethal force in a training bout. Commander Dole called for a halt. She continued the engagement after the halt was called. A cadet was dead. Regardless of provocation, regardless of circumstance, the Academy's conduct code prohibited lethal force in ranked sparring. The code existed precisely for situations like this, to ensure that disputes between cadets did not escalate to irreversible outcomes. It was clean, it was logical, and it relied entirely on the premise that the rules meant the same thing to a dead man's family as they did to the woman he had tried to murder. Marin stood when the prosecution finished. She did not begin with an opening statement. She activated her datapad and projected a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber. Security recording, Ring 6, timestamp 09:14:37, she said. Cadet Dasari, entering the sparring ring. The footage played. Korvan walking toward Ring 6, rolling his shoulders. Marin paused the footage and zoomed in on his forearms. Medical imaging overlay, she said. The image shifted to a composite scan that showed Korvan's bone spur implants beneath his plating. They were already in the pre-deployment position. The cartilage anchors rotated to the release configuration, the spur tips aligned with the deployment channels. These implants were pre-staged before the bout began, Marin said. The deployment mechanism requires a deliberate 6-second activation sequence involving voluntary contraction of 3 muscle groups in a specific order. It cannot be triggered by reflex, adrenaline, or involuntary stress response. Cadet Dasari activated his lethal implants before he entered the ring. The decision to deploy banned weaponry against an unarmed opponent was premeditated. She dismissed the scan and pulled up a document. This is a formal complaint I filed with Academy Judicial Affairs 6 weeks prior to the incident, documenting an escalating pattern of targeted harassment by Cadet Dasari. She projected the filing date, the acknowledgement receipt, and the case status. The status read, under review, 6 weeks, no action taken, no investigation opened, no protective measures implemented. The Academy was informed that Cadet Dasari posed a credible threat to my safety. The Academy took no action. The bracket algorithm then placed me in a ranked bout against the individual I had formally identified as a threat. I watched the panel's faces. Dole's chromatophores were cycling through Rithani institutional shame. The 2 judicial officers were making notes. Thorvin Dasari's plating had flushed to a shade of gray so dark it was nearly black. Then she cited Article 9, word for word, from memory. The article stated that any cadet subjected to an attack involving undisclosed lethal augmentations during a regulated bout retained the legal right to respond with force proportionate to the demonstrated threat, up to and including lethal force, without penalty. She pulled up 3 precedent cases. 3 previous incidents in Academy history where a cadet killed an opponent during a bout after the opponent deployed banned weaponry. In each case, the surviving cadet had been cleared under Article 9. In each case, the surviving cadet had been non-human. She placed the 3 cases on the display side by side and asked the panel a single question. If the species in this room were reversed, if a Veldrathi cadet had killed a human attacker who deployed concealed lethal implants, would this tribunal have been convened? Nobody answered. The question did not require an answer. Thorvin Dasari spoke. His voice was layered with harmonic resonance. Cadet Hale. My nephew was the 3rd-ranked combatant at this academy. He was armored, he was armed. He outweighed you by a factor that barely registers on scales built for combat organisms. His plating shifted, exposing the bone spurs along his own forearms. Explain to this tribunal how a baseline human killed a Veldrathi warrior with her bare hands. Marin did not flinch. Training, she said. Thousands of hours of training against simulated Veldrathi opponents, studying skeletal structure, neural mapping, arterial pathways, plating coverage gaps, and stress response behaviors. I know where your species is strong. I know where it is weak. I know how your plating moves under rotational force, which nerve clusters produce motor shutdown when compressed, and which arterial feeds are accessible through the gaps that form when your cervical plates extend during aggressive posturing. She delivered this the way someone describes learning a musical instrument: patient, precise, methodical. The technique I used is designated VT7. It is one of 12 in the Veldrathi Close Quarters module. It was the appropriate response to a frontal lunge with extended bone spurs by a larger opponent. I selected it because it was the only technique with a survival probability above 90%, given the speed, angle, and proximity of the incoming strike. I did not choose it because it was lethal. I chose it because every alternative left a significant probability that the bone spur would reach my carotid artery before I could neutralize the threat. The silence that followed was not shock. The room had moved past shock days ago. It was the silence of every species in the chamber, simultaneously processing the same implication. Humans had studied them, all of them. Not casually, not academically, systematically. They had mapped the weaknesses of every species the way a cartographer maps terrain, and they had developed specific, practiced, refined techniques to exploit those weaknesses. Every species in that room had a page in a human training manual somewhere. Every delegate, every officer, every cadet sitting in the gallery was looking at Marin Hale and wondering the same thing. Does she know how to kill me too? And the answer, based on everything she had just described, everything her file contained, everything the 3-second sequence in Ring 6 had demonstrated, was almost certainly yes. I watched the panel members process this. The Drenari magistrate had gone very still, the way his species does when their analytical functions override their emotional processing. He was calculating, not the legal outcome of the tribunal. That was already determined by the evidence, but the strategic implications of what the tribunal had just revealed. Commander Desari was staring at a fixed point on the wall behind Marin's head, with the intensity of someone trying to burn a hole through solid metal with sheer concentration. Thorvin Desari's bone plating was clicking rapidly, an involuntary response that Veldrathi produce when their threat assessment systems are overwhelmed by conflicting inputs. His body was telling him he was in danger. His rational mind was telling him this was a judicial proceeding in a controlled environment. The conflict between those two assessments was visible in every plate on his face. The tribunal recessed. During the recess, cadets approached me in the corridor. 8 of them, 5 species, all asking the same question. Did you know what she was? I told them no. None of us did. A Sorvathi officer named Dellen grabbed my arm as I walked back toward the chamber. She leaned close. They are not angry at Marin Hale, she said. They are frightened. And when enough species are frightened at the same time, they do not think clearly. They think collectively, and collective fear has started more wars than collective anger ever has. She walked away. I stood in the corridor and realized she was right. This tribunal was not about one dead Veldrathi cadet. It was about what his death had revealed. The species everyone dismissed as soft and small and unremarkable had been, quietly, patiently, systematically preparing to survive against all of them. Not to conquer, not to dominate, to survive. And that distinction was the most terrifying part. The tribunal reconvened after 97 minutes. I could tell from the panel members' faces that the deliberation had not been comfortable. Commander Dole looked like a man who had made a decision he knew would cost him, but could not in good conscience make any other way. The Drenari magistrate had the settled expression of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through rigorous analysis and was now bracing for the consequences. The Sorvathi judicial officer looked exhausted, in a way that went beyond physical fatigue, as though the case had forced her to confront assumptions about the galactic order that she had carried, unchallenged for her entire career. Thorvin Desari looked like he had been outvoted and knew it, and his fury at that fact was contained behind his plating the way pressure is contained behind a dam. The gallery was completely silent. Even the environmental systems seemed to hold their breath. I could feel the attention of every being in the room converging on Commander Dole as he stood and picked up a datapad containing the ruling. Dole read the verdict. His voice was flat, deliberately stripped of inflection, the vocal equivalent of a legal document being entered into the record. He was not editorializing. He was not interpreting. He was reading words that 3 out of 4 panel members had agreed upon, and he was making certain that no one could later claim the tone of delivery implied anything beyond the text itself. The tribunal finds, by a 3-to-1 majority, that Cadet Marin Hale acted within the legal boundaries established by Article 9, Section 3 of the Academy Combat Code. The deployment of banned lethal augmentation by the deceased constituted a clear and immediate threat to Cadet Hale's life. Her response was proportional to the threat, consistent with established precedent, and executed within the time frame that precluded compliance with the halt command. The kill is classified as lawful self-defense under lethal provocation. All charges are dismissed. He paused. The chamber held its breath. Cadet Hale is reinstated to active status, effective immediately. Her combat ranking will be adjusted to reflect demonstrated capability. The ranking display updated. Marin Hale moved from 34th to 2nd. Not 1st. 2nd. Everyone in the room understood what it meant. She was ranked second because it was politically convenient, not because anyone above her could beat her. The Veldrathi section of the gallery emptied before Dolol finished speaking, 30 armored figures filing out in formation, plating locked in the rigid configuration that signaled formal diplomatic severance. The sound of their boots on the chamber floor was rhythmic and deliberate, a martial cadence that communicated contempt more effectively than any speech could have. They did not look back. They did not acknowledge the panel. They walked out of the room and out of the institution, and, effectively, out of the alliance that had held the galaxy's major military powers together for 3 centuries. Within 6 hours, House Dasari announced the withdrawal of all financial support from the Academy. Every credit, every endowment, every equipment donation, every faculty position they had funded, every research grant, the biomedical wing they had built from the ground up, received a 90-day closure notice. 14 Veldrathi cadets packed their quarters and boarded transport ships before the end of the day. 3 of them, I learned later, had privately corroborated Marin's account of Korvan's harassment during the investigation. They left anyway. Institutional loyalty, when it conflicts with species solidarity, loses every time. The financial impact was staggering. Dasari money represented nearly 12% of the Academy's operating budget. Its removal meant program cuts, facility closures, instructor layoffs, reduced enrollment capacity. The Academy had been weaponized by its own funding structure, and the weapon had finally fired. The fallout radiated outward. 3 species delegations filed formal intelligence inquiries about the Terran Integrated Combat Program, demanding disclosure of what techniques had been developed against their biologies. 2 delegations transmitted military intelligence alerts to their home governments. The Cathori Diplomatic Corps, my own government, sent a priority communication to Terran diplomatic channels, requesting full disclosure of any combat methodologies targeting Cathori physiology. The Terran delegation responded to all inquiries with a single statement, identical in every case, delivered with the bland formality of a government that had been expecting this conversation for a very long time. The Terran Integrated Combat Program exists as a defensive capability developed in response to the documented threat landscape of interstellar military engagement. The program's scope, methodologies, and specific content remain classified under Terran national security protocols. Disclosure is not authorized under any existing treaty framework. The techniques employed by Lieutenant Hale were consistent with standard defensive protocols against lethal threat escalation. No offensive doctrine was applied. The Terran government reaffirms its commitment to the principles of the Conclave Integration Compact. We consider this matter closed. 7 sentences. No apology, no reassurance, no negotiation. The statement confirmed everything without revealing anything. The program existed, it was classified. The techniques were standard, meaning they were part of a curriculum, meaning there were more techniques they had not seen. And the last sentence, we consider this matter closed, was the diplomatic equivalent of a door slamming. The humans were not asking for permission to keep their secrets. They were informing the galaxy that the secrets would be kept, regardless of what the galaxy wanted. And the silence between those 7 sentences was louder than any of the words, because the gaps contained implications that no diplomat could address, and no military strategist could ignore. How many humans had been through the program? How many were currently deployed in positions throughout the conclave? Working jobs, attending institutions, living in civilian communities, carrying the same lethal knowledge behind the same unremarkable faces. Were the 9 human cadets at the Academy all graduates, or were some of them standard recruits who genuinely belonged in the 34th position and had no secret curriculum hidden behind their brown or blue or green eyes? There was no way to know. That was the genius of it. You could not distinguish a program graduate from a standard human by looking at them. They carried no augmentations, no implants, no visible modifications. Their weapons were knowledge and practice, and the patience to wait until the knowledge was needed. And the only way to discover whether a particular human was carrying that knowledge was to attack them and see what happened, which was exactly the experiment Korvan Dasari had conducted, and his experimental results were conclusive and final. I watched the political machinery grind from the uncomfortable distance of a cadet who had suddenly become relevant to conversations far above his rank. Intelligence officers from the Cathori contacted me through channels I did not know the Academy's communication system supported. They wanted to know what Marin had used in sparring. They wanted to know if I had observed any Cathori-specific techniques. They wanted to know if she had ever targeted the nerve clusters along my ventral seam, or the respiratory nodes beneath my secondary arms. I told them the truth. I did not know. She had used techniques I could not identify. Some might have been Cathori in origin. Some might have been something else. I could not distinguish between her studying my species' vulnerabilities and her simply being a good fighter. Because the terrifying genius of her approach was that the two were indistinguishable until the moment she decided to show the difference. The intelligence officers were not satisfied with my answers. Nobody was satisfied with anyone's answers. The entire conclave was suddenly engaged in an intelligence-gathering exercise focused on a single question. What else do the humans know about us? The Academy resumed operations after 2 weeks, but normal was a word that had been emptied of its meaning. Every species looked at every human differently now. Not with hostility, though there was some. Not with fear, though there was plenty. With attention. The kind of careful, constant, calibrated attention you give to something that has demonstrated it operates on a fundamentally different level than you assumed. The human cadets noticed the change. Of course they did. They were trained to notice changes in behavioral patterns. They did not acknowledge it publicly. They continued attending classes, completing assignments, participating in training exercises, with the same quiet competence they had always displayed. But I saw something new in their interactions with each other. Brief glances exchanged across crowded rooms. Subtle shifts in their seating positions during lectures, the way they instinctively mapped exits and sightlines in every space they entered. They were preparing for whatever came next, the way they always prepared. Quietly, completely, without asking permission. The cadets who had bullied, mocked, or dismissed human participants stopped overnight. Not because anyone ordered them to, because the cost-benefit analysis had changed permanently. The potential gain from asserting dominance over a human cadet was minor. A moment of social reinforcement, a small surge of hierarchical satisfaction. The potential cost was now understood to be lethal, delivered in 3 seconds, using your own biology as the weapon. No rational being makes that trade. More surprisingly, some cadets began seeking out human training partners. Not many, a handful. A Threnaki from the Advanced Tactics section asked to join Marin's sparring rotation. A Drenari from the Intelligence track requested permission to observe her training sessions from the gallery. They were not trying to learn human techniques. They were trying to understand the philosophy behind them, the thinking that produced a fighter who could dismantle any species she encountered, but chose restraint as her default setting and lethality as her exception. 3 weeks after the tribunal, I found Marin alone in Training Hall 7. It was late in the station's artificial night cycle, and the hall was empty except for her. She was not practicing combat techniques. She was moving slowly through a series of fluid, circular motions, her arms tracing arcs through the air, as though sculpting something invisible, her weight shifting with a rhythm connected to her breathing rather than to any external threat. "It is called Tai Chi," she said without turning around. "It is a human practice, very old. It is not designed for fighting. It is designed for balance, internal balance." I stood in the doorway with my forearms folded. "You knew I was coming. You have been walking past this hall every night for 11 days. Tonight you stopped." She finished the form and turned to face me. She looked tired. Not physically, but the kind of tired that comes from carrying a weight that has nothing to do with the body. "Why did you come here?" I asked. "To the academy. You are more dangerous than anyone in this institution, including the instructors. What could they possibly teach you?" She sat on the training mat, crossing her legs. "How to not fight. The program trained me how to fight every species in the galaxy. 47,000 hours of learning how to break things that evolution spent millions of years building. I am very good at it. That is not a boast, it is a fact, and the fact terrifies me as much as it terrifies you." She looked up at me. "I came here to learn how other species think about violence. Whether they see it the way we do, as a failure state, a last resort, something to be precise about rather than proud of. I wanted to know if the galaxy produces soldiers who understand that the highest form of combat training is learning when not to use it. Corvan did not give you that option." "No." She was quiet for a moment. I reviewed every alternative in the 3 seconds I had: deflection, joint lock without fracture, submission hold, targeted nerve strike to induce unconsciousness. 4 options. The spur was already past the point of deflection when I made contact with his wrist. The only technique with a survival probability above 90% was VT7. The lethal one. Yes. She met my eyes. I chose to live, Reth. I will always choose to live. But I do not celebrate the cost. I felt the weight of a life removed from the universe by my hands. And that weight never gets lighter, no matter how justified the reason, or how many times you carry it. I believed her, not because her words were convincing, though they were, but because I had spent 9 sparring sessions on the receiving end of a restraint so deliberate, so consistent, so carefully maintained, that it could only come from someone who understood exactly what they were restraining. She had pulled every punch. She had softened every takedown. She had let me score points I now knew I had not earned. Because the alternative was showing me something the galaxy was not ready to see. Until Korvan forced her hand. Until a boy with bone spurs and a noble name decided the rules existed for everyone except him, and discovered in 3 seconds that the small, quiet human he had been tormenting for months was not a victim waiting to happen, but a precisely calibrated response to every threat his species had ever evolved to deliver. "Will you still spar with me?" she asked, knowing what you know now. I thought about it. Not the reflexive yes of a cadet maintaining a training partnership, but the considered decision of a Cathori who had been told, explicitly, that the person across the ring knew 12 ways to kill a Veldrathi, and an unspecified number of ways to kill him. "Yes," I said. "Why?" "Because the alternative is ignorance, and ignorance is what killed Korvan." Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, exactly. Something smaller and more honest. An acknowledgement that my answer had landed somewhere she did not expect, in the space between fear and respect where real partnerships begin. We walked to the ring. She took one side. I took the other. We bowed. A human custom I had adopted because it mattered to her, and it mattered to me that it mattered to her. She let me land the first strike. A clean jab to her right shoulder. Technically scored. Undeniably allowed. I knew she let me. She knew I knew. We both accepted it. Because that restraint, that deliberate, patient, carefully calibrated restraint, was the most human thing about her. It was not mercy. Mercy implies superiority. It was respect. The respect of someone who could take everything, and chooses to take nothing, not because they have to, but because they believe that power without discipline is just destruction wearing a name tag. We sparred for 40 minutes. She used a style I had not seen before, something fluid and circular that seemed designed to redirect force rather than oppose it. I recognized elements of it from the Tai Chi she had been practicing, but adapted, sharpened, given an edge that the meditative form did not carry. She was showing me something. Not her full capability, she would never show me that, but something real. A glimpse behind the curtain, offered freely, as a trust exercise between two people who had both learned things about each other that changed the shape of their relationship permanently. When we finished, she sat on the edge of the ring and drank water from a standard-issue bottle, and for a moment, she looked like what she was. A 26-year-old woman who had been given too much responsibility too early, and carried it with a grace that most people mistook for ease. I sat beside her. Neither of us spoke for a while. The training hall hummed around us, the environmental systems maintaining the artificial atmosphere that kept 11 species alive on a station floating in the void between stars. "Vreth," she said eventually. "Yes. Thank you for coming back." She did not elaborate. She did not need to. I understood what she meant. She had revealed what she was, and I had not retreated from it. In a galaxy where the revelation of human capability was generating diplomatic crises and intelligence alerts, and existential recalculations across dozens of species, one Cathori cadet had walked back into the training hall and asked to spar again. That meant something to her. Something I suspected she did not allow to mean too much, because allowing things to mean too much was a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities were what she spent 47,000 hours learning to exploit. But she said thank you. And I heard in those two words everything she could not say, that the loneliest thing about being what she was lay not in the killing, but in the isolation, in carrying knowledge so dangerous that it created distance between her and every living being she encountered. In understanding that every relationship she formed at the academy, every friendship, every training partnership, every casual conversation in the commissary, existed in the shadow of what she could do if the relationship changed. She lived in a world where trust was a constant calculation, and she chose to extend it anyway. That took a kind of courage that had nothing to do with combat. And somewhere in the back of my mind, in the space where instinct and analysis intersect, I understood something about humans that no intelligence briefing, no diplomatic inquiry, no classified program disclosure would ever capture with the precision it deserved. They were not the most violent species in the galaxy. They were not the strongest or the fastest or the most heavily armored. What they were was something far more unsettling, something that would keep the Conclave's intelligence services awake for decades and reshape every military doctrine from the core worlds to the rim. They were thorough. Every species in the galaxy trained its soldiers to fight enemies. Humans trained their soldiers to understand enemies, to study them the way a physician studies anatomy. Not with hatred, but with the clinical, exhaustive, deeply patient attention required to map every strength and exploit every vulnerability. And then, having completed that map, they trained their soldiers to fold it up, put it away, and walk into a room full of those species with open hands and steady breathing, carrying the knowledge of exactly how to kill everyone present, and choosing, deliberately, not to. That restraint was the weapon. Not the techniques, not the 47,000 hours. The restraint, the fact that Marin Hale could have ended any bout, any confrontation, any threat she encountered at this academy from the moment she arrived, and instead, she chose to sit at 34th and wrap her hands and let Corvan Desari call her prey, because the mission was never about proving what humans could do. It was about proving what humans chose not to do, until someone forced the choice. I used to think the galaxy feared humans because they were violent. I was wrong. The galaxy fears humans because they are precise. Violence is chaos. What Marin Hale did in that ring was not chaos. It was architecture. 3 seconds of structure so perfect that it turned a Veldrathi warrior's own body into the instrument of his death, executed by a woman who grieved the outcome even as she delivered it. That is what frightens the galaxy. Not the capacity for destruction, the capacity for understanding. Because destruction has limits. You can armor against it. You can build walls, deploy shields, engineer defenses, but you cannot armor against being understood. You cannot build a wall between yourself and someone who has already mapped every crack in your foundation, every flaw in your design, every vulnerability in the biology you thought made you invincible. And now every species in the Conclave is quietly wondering the same thing I am wondering. The question that will define the next century of interstellar relations. The question no intelligence service will ever fully answer, because the humans will never fully let them. What else have they built that we have not seen yet? I do not know the answer. Marin might. The unnamed woman with no rank insignia certainly does. The 47,000 hours recorded in a training file somewhere in a human database contain answers the galaxy is not ready for, and may never be. But I know this. I will be in the training hall tomorrow morning. I will stand across the mat from Marin Hale. I will bow. She will bow. And we will begin again. Because she is the most dangerous person I have ever known. And she has never once used that danger against me. And that choice, repeated daily, without fanfare, without recognition, without any expectation of gratitude, is the most extraordinary thing I have witnessed in my entire life. Not the killing, the not killing, the 1,000 moments when she could have and did not. That is what I will remember when the tribunal transcript fades, and the diplomatic cables are archived, and Corvan Desari becomes a footnote in a history that is still being written by the species that everyone else tried to write off. The galaxy looked at Earth and saw a small, fragile world full of soft creatures, who had clawed their way to sentience through stubbornness, rather than strength. The galaxy saw humans and measured them by the only metrics it understood: size, armor, venom, speed, the crude arithmetic of biological warfare. By those metrics, humans were unremarkable. By those metrics, Marin Hale should have died in Ring 6. She did not die. Korvan Desari died. And the distance between those two outcomes was not luck, or rage, or the desperate improvisation of a cornered animal. It was 12 years of preparation, 47,000 hours. To childhood sacrificed on the altar of a species' survival strategy so comprehensive that it accounted for threats that had not yet materialized and opponents who had not yet been born. Marin Hale taught me that the most powerful thing in the galaxy is not force, it is restraint, and the species that has mastered both is the one you should never, ever underestimate. I used to think humans were small. I was measuring the wrong thing.